Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this, our first colloquium on race, equity, and social justice for the 2022-2023 academic year. I'm Stephanie Shanakan. I'm the new Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, and I'm a professor of ethnomusicology in the School of Music. ARHU, that is the College of Arts and Humanities, launched this series in 2020 as part of the college's broader initiative on race, equity, and social justice. It was developed around the goal of using the college's expertise to better understand and more effectively dismantle structural racism wherever we find it. This broader initiative includes transforming our curriculum, reducing discrimination in teaching, research, and service, and expanding the impact of the college's longstanding and continuing scholarship on racism, anti-racism, equity, and justice. All of this is why I'm so excited that I'm here now. I'm in my third month and I'm very excited, particularly about series like this. Throughout this series, the college has also worked to incorporate President Pine's focus on racial justice and identity, and we have welcomed students participating in the college's Terrapin Strong onboarding program. In ARHU, part of our approach to this program is to expose students to the many different ways our faculty in the college study and teach about race, equity, and justice. I want to thank my colleagues in the Dean's Office, Associate Dean Patrick Warfield, Ashley Richardson, Shante Ingram, and the entire marketing and communications team for their work on this. And as ever, a warm shout out to my predecessor, Dr. Bonnie Thornton-Dill, who started this incredible series. This year, I have invited faculty from across the college to continue these important conversations. And this morning, I'm delighted, my first one, to welcome Dr. Catherine Knight Steele, Associate Professor in the Department of Communication, and she's also the founding director of the Andrew W. Mellon funded African American Digital Humanities Initiative, and she now directs the Black Communication and Technology Lab as a part of the Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Collaboration, and Optimism Network, which the acronym is DISCO, which I love it, also funded by the Mellon Foundation. Dr. Steele's research focuses on race, gender, and media with a specific emphasis on African-American culture and discourses in traditional and new media. She examines media representations of marginalized communities and how those communities utilize online technology as a form of resistance. This morning, we will discuss her book, Digital Black Feminism, and the ways scholars can marry digital research with historical and archival work as we consider a path for the humanities and for Black liberation in the digital age. Side note, very excited about what Catherine does, because as a Black mother, I have seen my children engage in digital media in many ways. I have also seen how Black women and Black folks generally coped with the pandemic through social media. And we can talk a lot about that, but I don't want to take up too much more time. Hold on, let me see, make sure I'm on this. Let me talk about our format. So this morning, we will be following a similar format to past sessions. Dr. Steele will begin with a brief presentation. She has also agreed to do a reading because I think this book is so beautifully written. Then she and I will engage in a conversation around the issues posed by her research, and then we'll open it up to the floor for your questions. I'll request that you keep your microphones on mute during the presentation. And then please drop your questions in the chat or send them directly to Associate Dean Patrick Warfield, who will be moderating the Q&A. When the time comes, you can also use Zoom's raise hand feature, and you'll be invited to unmute and ask your question. Please note, this event is being recorded for future viewing on ARHU's website. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Professor Catherine Knight Steele to open this up with a discussion on digital Black feminism. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I am so thrilled to be here and to spend some time with you all today talking about digital Black feminism. I'm going to start with a couple of short excerpts from the introduction of the book. The introduction is titled, "For the Black Girls Who Don't Code." Books about race are often about Black men. Books about technology are often about white men. And books about feminism are often about white women. This book is about Black women. Studying Black women is often considered too niche. In the early years of my career, various senior scholars advised me to study Black folks' discourse online by comparing it to whiteness. In graduate school, a faculty member suggested that my dissertation research on the Black blogosphere would be much more interesting if I compared this community of writers to recent European immigrants online. When you decide to center Black folks, Black culture, and Black discourse, this provokes questions of validity and objectivity. However, those in the dominant group who study themselves, one, never have to name their work as the study of white folks, and two, are lauded for their work's breadth and broad applicability. But as was the case in grad school, when I politely declined that faculty member's placement on my committee, I have little interest in writing a comparative analysis between Black women's use of technology and Black men's or white women's. Instead, in this book, I place Black women at the center of conceptualizing technology and digital culture. I argue that Black women's historical and persistent relationship with technology provides the most generative means of studying the possibilities and constraints of our ever-changing digital world. I'm going to skip ahead. As Brittany Cooper explains, there is a dearth of real knowledge about Black women public intellectuals. Lifestyle blogging, natural hair tutorials, online snark, and perfectly placed memes do not mark digital Black feminists as superficial or untethered to serious scholarship. None of these practices exclude them from liberation work. They locate their spaces of retreat alongside their activist work, often earning their living by using the tools of a digital capitalistic superstructure. As Cooper concludes, Black women are serious thinkers, and it is our scholarly duty to take them seriously. I want to thank you all so much, and I want to spend some time today thinking about what brought me to writing this text and how this is actually a very different book than I thought that I'd be writing when I decided to write about Black women online. Anyone who picks up this book might be a little bit disappointed at first from the titling of Digital Black Feminism, that the first few chapters of the text pay very little attention to spaces like TikTok or Twitter or any other social media platform, actually. I spend a good portion of this book tracing what I call the long history of Black women's relationship to technology. When I first came to Maryland not a few now, 7 years ago, I had the privilege and pleasure of working alongside someone I looked up to from my undergraduate days, Dr. Patricia Hill Collins. And there is a quote by her that I find exceptionally useful to me in thinking about the need to trace this long history of Black women's relationship to technology. Dr. Collins said, "The shadow obscuring a complex Black women's intellectual tradition is neither accidental nor benign." In the first few chapters of this book, I trace the way exactly that it comes to not be benign, in my opinion, but that it is an intentional process whereby the work, the expertise, and the skill of Black women has been divorced from the very terminology of technology. I often ask audiences at the start of these kinds of talks to think about where they first developed their own ideas about what a technology is. How did you first come to understand what constituted technological expertise? Did you read about it in a textbook or watch something on the news that told you something about what a technology was? Perhaps you heard stories from friends or family about how to get better at technology, or you read stories about people like Bill Gates building their technological empires in their garages. For many, if not most of us, the legacy and the history of Black women and technology was not a part of those stories or those narratives. What I am attempting to do in this text is provide us a starting point, for thinking about a new framework that actually centers Black women in our trajectory of talking about technology in the past, in the present, and in the future, recentering our notion of what it means to do technological skilled work and what it means to rethink our very definition of feminism and Black feminism. A definition of Black feminism that doesn't emerge out of the waves of feminism as we've mostly been taught, and that does not actually center white women in its responsiveness. So instead, to do so, I begin in perhaps an unusual place, a barbershop. Well, I should be more clear, I begin in the beauty shop. My dissertation research was about the digital barbershop. I traced the ways that the early Black blogosphere brought Black folks together online into small corners of the internet to do incredibly important political work outside the view of the dominant group. But as I was finishing up that dissertation work and really ruminating on what caused me to start writing about the blogosphere, I had to be honest with myself that it wasn't Black men, but Black women's labor online that I was interested in studying, even though my dissertation titling didn't suggest that. So I returned in this text, in this book, to Black women's spaces, the way that Black women's work is often hidden from the dominant group, the way that Black women go about the task of recentering themselves in their own existence and in their discourse, in their discursive spaces. I like this beauty shop as a metaphor because it allows us to think about the way that our offline selves historically translate into our online practices. It is a beautifully humanistic way of thinking about histories and legacies and artifacts that we leave behind. The spaces of the beauty shop exist as activities that exist purely for Black women's benefit. It is quite unusual to find such a space in our society, a place where Black women are both the proprietors and the patrons, where the technology that is developed there is utilized to keep and maintain Black women's wholeness. So today I'm just going to talk about the 3 different ways that I kind of want to utilize the beauty shop to think about Black women's relationship to technology, why I think it's such an effective and useful metaphor for us to think about the future. The first one is about doing hair, about the actual praxis of what happens inside of a beauty shop. Doing hair focuses us on the actual tasks and skills of Black women. It requires us to think through the relationship that Black women form with their tools, and how historically we've taken tools that were meant for other purposes and repurposed them as tools of our own freedom. Some of you may have heard of things like Tignan laws that required Black women during the practice of chattel slavery to cover our hair. But Black women then took these headscarves and created beautiful representations of self, beautiful ways of showcasing ourselves and our beauty. Now, obviously, those scarves have now been taken and remarketed and sold on Instagram to anyone who can have them. But Black women also developed things like protective styles to manipulate our texture. We created versatility where other folks meant there to be restriction. The same thing happens in our online spaces like Twitter or Instagram, where Black women repurpose the affordances of platforms to do freedom's very work. Think about things like hashtags, which were initially meant to find for searchability, right? To create mechanisms for us to locate conversations of other folks. And look at what Black folks have done with hashtags. Look at these signifying practices that they've been imbued with. Look at hashtags like "You okay, sis?" and "Say her name," that not only highlight the crimes and violence against Black women, but allow us to locate places of solidarity and help for one another. The second reason I turned my attention to the beauty shop has to do with its possibility in showcasing entrepreneurship. Where else in our society do Black women operate their own small businesses completely separate from the dominant group, without the assistance usually of loans or capital? Places where Black women have historically had to learn how to market their own businesses, places where they've held their own businesses and their own proprietorships within their community. Many of us know the stories perhaps of women like Madam C.J. Walker, who used hair care technologies to build their own personal wealth while establishing a mechanism for other women to pursue their own wealth as well and pursue their own independent practices. But a lot more of us probably are familiar with our own stylists because of our color retouches and our silk presses, our retwists and our installations. And when we go to those shops, we understand how those salon owners, whether they're in a salon suite by themselves or located in a place with other Black women, have navigated this transition to digital marketing and branding with ease. They've moved from their kitchen counters to salon suites. They understand how to utilize sites like TikTok and Instagram to showcase their work. They can reach the audiences of their choice. They understand how to use their skill sets in ways that change with the times and yet pursue the same goals. I'm interested in studying the ways that this entrepreneurship moves from offline spaces to online and how it translates to places like blogging communities. How have we historically learned how to navigate spaces that simultaneously do the work of helping our community while being profitable to ourselves? The last reason that I look at places like the beauty shop is to think about something called an enclave. I started writing about the Black blogosphere some 15 years ago because I needed that space. I was working in advertising, my first job out of undergrad, and I was very much by myself. I was surrounded by folks who interacted and understood the world a lot differently than I did. But in the corner of my cubicle, I found solace in turning to the blogosphere, into this space where I didn't have to explain myself, where no one reached in for a good touch of my hair that day, a place where people understood and spoke in similar ways that I did. Enclaves, according to Catherine Squires, provide us these access points for understanding how communities who need to separate themselves from the dominant group for purposes of safety and security can find solace both offline and on. We see that in places like the beauty shop, where our ways of knowing and speaking and interacting are not challenged, where no one is saying, you're not talking right, you're not doing this right. Why is your hair different today than it was yesterday? But in these online spaces, we find this same mode of protection, where no one's asking the wrong questions, where we're able to dive deeply into subject matter without fear of reprisal from someone else, without someone from the outside group jumping in to tell us that we're getting it wrong. So I like this notion of a beauty shop because it gives us a mechanism to think about our long history, how it begins offline but translates into these online spaces. In the book, I explore several items, several different principles, as I outline, that help us navigate how rhetorical practices emerge in places like the blogosphere, and then translate into our more recognizable social media platforms today, like Twitter or Instagram. I also think about the very praxis of doing the labor of creating Black feminist thought online. What does it look like to capture ourselves in moments online? And how are we able to look back at Black feminist thinkers of the past, like Zora Neale Hurston, who was masterful at the art of capturing the very essence of communities, their dialogue, and their discourse? How has Black women's relationship with publishing shifted between practices off and online? We might believe we have more agency in what we publish, but with that agency to publish more items comes the increased scrutiny of folks being able to have constant access to our personal lives alongside our academic prose. And finally, how do metaphors like stitching and threading allow us to understand how Black women's work is always about bringing together the elements of ourselves and our communities in a public sphere where people are able to have access to our thoughts and our ideas. I conclude the book, as I'll conclude this talk, by thinking about the future. If we want to know about the past and we want to translate it to the future, if we really actually want to listen to Black women, we have to be quite realistic about where we've been and where we're going. I conclude the book thinking about a Black feminist future and what it would mean to take up some of those principles that I study. What would happen if we took seriously the call to listen to Black women as we think about the possibilities that may exist for us in our digital milieu? How realistic is it to begin to give Black women credit for all of the work that they do, both on and offline, to bring America closer to its promise of freedom for all? And when Black women are given that credit, when we are given that capital, what happens to the very ideas of Black feminist thought? If and when Black feminist thought becomes a commodity for sale in digital culture, can the ideas and the practices of Black feminism actually remain intact? I wrap the book by thinking about a funny viral video that came out some years back called Intersectionality Pizza. I encourage you to look it up if you haven't seen it before, but a comedian named Akilah Hughes runs through the ideas of intersectionality by describing items on a pizza, assigning deluxe pizzas to Black women and cheese pizzas to white women. It's a funny clip. And it does some of the work of explaining intersectionality in a very basic way. And it goes viral, right? But what I want to understand is, what do we do with the ideas that can't be summarized in a viral video? What do we do with the concepts, the complex and difficult ideas that can't find their ways into hashtagable lines? How do we still honor the fact that we need the long conversations? We need the challenges and the debates and the spaces that allow us to parse through the difficult moments as a community of understanding. It's series like these, I think, that are meant to start up and do that very work. So I'm very appreciative for being included in this tradition of the Dean's Office and inviting me to participate in these kinds of conversations, and for encouraging our college to continue to show the ways that the humanities are actually a pathway to thinking not just about our past, but about our present and our future as well. I'm very excited to be in conversation with you, Dean, and with the rest of you to talk more about digital Black feminism. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was wonderful. You begin, of course, with a reading of parts of the introduction, which again are beautifully written. The whole book is worthy of all the awards and accolades it's getting, and I know those are continuing. And we're very, very proud of you as a wonderful member of our college and campus. So let me start with saying that I actually have spent the whole week listening and re-listening to Dirty Computer by Janelle Monáe, because I think it really serves as a great soundtrack to our conversation, but also to thinking about how technology also serves as its own metaphor for what Black women go through, and for this enclave that you talk about. So my first question will be more, I wanted to ask a question about how you came to this point, but I think that your introduction has helped us kind of trace your journey to this field of study. So the question I want to ask is around something that you're asking us to think about, which is, how do we study Black people ethically? What's the praxis of studying Black people in this space, in this way? We're in an era now where we're trying to send a lot of Black students to STEM fields and so on. And I'd love to hear you talk about the ethics of studying Black people, but also the ways in which we take this type of direction into quote unquote DEI work on campuses, making our campuses more diverse and our fields of study more diverse. So it's kind of a two-part question.
Thank you so much. It's a great, I think, way to start. I kind of love when I'm talking to audiences that care about method, because I'm kind of a method nerd. So the way that I answer this question, honestly, with graduate students who begin their inquiry into doing studies of Black digitality, and they say, well, what methods do I need to learn in order to study Black women online or to study marginalized groups more broadly? My answer is always the same, and it begins with, you need to learn as many methods as possible, because your question will always guide your method. That if you begin with the idea that there are a lot of ways out there to study discursive practice, and there are a lot of ways to say, I'm a comm scholar, right? There are a lot of ways to study the way that folks group themselves together online, and how resistance forms and how joy can be studied. And if we begin with the idea that there's no right or correct way to do that, right? That there is big data analysis that is useful, and there is the practice of doing work on small bits of text and diving deeply that is just as useful as those big studies that get a lot of the funding and the attention. But in this text, the questions that I was interested in asking, I couldn't answer with millions and millions of tweets. I couldn't answer ethically by scraping the web free of context to try to locate the words of Black folks and Black people online, because what I would be doing in that process is replicating the kinds of harms that very frequently come to our communities when people have an outside interest in Black folks for reasons that are not about keeping Black folks safe. And so the way that I approached this work was rather tedious, but very contextually appropriate. I believe that to do some of the kind of work that we want to do, we have to be there while it's happening. That's not an easy answer to a lot of grad students who have a quick process and need to get done with their dissertation work. But I'll give you a couple of examples from my own writing. There were tweets that happened along the way from folks that I followed online for 6 or 7 years to write this book, who later deleted those tweets, or whose tweets didn't have a hashtag where I could easily locate them to know the context of what they were talking about. That in fact, I had to know that someone we mutually followed tweeted about one thing in the morning and that they were responding without actually replying later that day. I had to understand that folks' Instagram stories went away after 24 hours. And so if I wasn't present to see how they were responding to the news events or how they were publicizing certain events differently on different platforms, I would miss that note. I would miss that context. And I often say that our method for approaching digital scholarship in this way needs to in some ways replicate the way that we approach our scholarship in the archive as well. For this text, I spent a lot of time with the materials of Zora Neale Hurston and Anna Julia Cooper. I read their diaries and their letters, and I couldn't be there while they were writing them. But I could spend so much time lost in those pages that I forgot what my question was to begin with. And instead, I had to focus on getting to know that person. And so my answer to how we begin to study marginalized groups more ethically is to see them as full human beings, to treat their words as having come from someone for some purpose, that it being our task to understand that context and that purpose before we reprint and republish them in ways that could cause harm to those individuals, that we be in contact with people as often as possible to make sure that we're getting it right. And a lot of that actually requires us to step away from the things that are actually the easiest projects to undertake or the ways that we can most quickly and easily get things published. They require time, they require energy, and they require intention. And I think that all of those translate really well to DEI work. Getting in and getting out, funding programs that are short-lived but don't actually get to know the communities that we're working with, don't work as a part of DEI work. It is time and context and intention and community that make a difference as much in our research and our methods as they do in our diversity, equity, and inclusion work.
Great, thank you, Catherine. That resonates so well with me, both as an ethnomusicologist who studies popular culture, where scholars want to do the quick work of writing a piece on Beyonce or whatever and getting it published, right? So yeah, your push for deep dives and context and leaning in and being attentive is something that really speaks to my own scholarship. And then, of course, your thoughts on DEI, something that we in the Dean's Office and in this college we're thinking about deeply as well. So I'm really grateful that my colleagues are in the room too, and we're listening carefully. And my next question will be something that that you also made reference to in your introduction, but I'd like you to talk a little bit more about this. I love the fact that you intentionally position this work not as in comparison to white women or other kinds of demographics. You are centering Black women here, and for that I'm very grateful. But you also do a very good job of and a deliberate job of defining Black women across generation, their stances, the types of Black feminism that have evolved, and So I'd like you to sort of help trace that a little bit, which you do beautifully in the introduction and throughout the book. I love where you bring in Zora Neale Hurston as a way of thinking about Lovey Ajayi, which is, again, a very nice thread across history. What does understanding this sort of history of Black feminism offer us all?
Thanks for that. For me, it was liberating to study Black feminist thought, not as a comparison, because I think for many of us, maybe in high school, undergrad, if you were so fortunate to read about feminist thought and feminist inquiry and Black feminist inquiry, the first thing I read before I took a class with a Black woman was that Black feminism developed as a response to feminism, right? That it came out of a second wave of feminism. But then I was very fortunate to actually sit with the work of Black feminist scholars and scholarship, and instead learn how that way of telling the story was first of all just not accurate, but also was really dismissive of the long history of work that Black women in these United States have been doing since we were kidnapped and brought here, right? That the way of pushing back against white supremacy and patriarchy concurrently was happening for decades and centuries before we were being written about in history books as responding to white women later. And so that for me was incredibly liberating space to begin my work. Instead of beginning as deficient or as not quite right or not figuring things out later, or Black feminism evolving in this responsive way, of centering and really prioritizing the way that Black women had developed their own discursive practices, their own strategies of activism, their own practices of care in the 1600s and 1700s and 1800s, well before the white women's feminist movement ever began on these shores, was really instructive to me about how we could think about a future of Black feminist thought. That what Black women have always been fighting for is not a place within the hegemonic order, that they have not been fighting to prove their strength or their validity, but rather to dismantle systems that are corrupt and hurt all of us. And that is the path then forward. And so what I then trace in the book beyond that is how Black feminism itself has changed, and has changed based on relationships to popular culture, based on things like hip hop. And I would argue right now is changing once again based on a relationship to digital technology. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to trace those kinds of changes over time. I know and I hope it is the case that in 10 years, this book will be greatly outdated as Black feminist thought has once again made evolutions and changes. But I think it's important that we trace those moments, because I think the relationship between Black feminist thought and digital technology isn't a thing to gloss over. And so much as Black women's ideas and way of disseminating their ideas have been changed by digital technology, but in turn, Black women have changed the technologies themselves. So the way that we think it is appropriate to use platforms like Instagram, the very possibilities that exist on a site like TikTok are bound up and wrapped up in the activities and the praxis of Black women. They are deeply connected to what Black feminist thinkers have told us is possible in those places. And so in order to understand what the next iterations of our digital technology is, or what our cultural milieu will be in 20 years, we have to pay attention to this present moment of what Black women are doing in these spaces and how they're doing it. The other reason I find this deeply important as someone who began to seriously study Black feminist thought late in graduate school is that I hear a lot of folks who want to study Black feminism and they want to apply Black feminist thinking to their studies and their research right now. And what I encourage them to do and to learn is that Black feminism is not a theory. It is a school of thought. It is an approach. It is an epistemology. And it features the work of many, many different thinkers who are advancing different ideas in different moments. And that complexity and that heterogeneity is really important for us to recognize the complexity of Black feminism as an important school of thought within our research and academic practice.
Great. Thinking about the heterogeneity of Black women, their approaches, their methods, takes me back again to the moment in the book where you bring up, of course, I'm in the book, I'm looking for all the musical moments, of course, because I study music.
Yeah.
And you get to the point where Lovey Ajayi is responding to the death of Aretha Franklin, right?
Yeah.
And there is this moment in the enclave, right, where Lovey Ajayi makes a statement about Tevin Campbell, and she is dragged, like she is
Bad.
really dragged. And you do bring up the fact that one of the issues is that she is her identity, so as Black women, we come from all different kinds of places and backgrounds and spaces, and so my question really is, and this will be my second to last question for now. If Patrick will let me in again, I will come back in. But what are the implications of allowing the mainstream to see to get a lens into the enclave? Like what are the dangers of that?
It's such a good question, and it's I think it's something that many of us who started doing this writing, 15 plus years ago are wrestling with today. We were doing the work early on of writing our own existence into the literature, right? Of arguing that we should be paid attention to also, because in grad school, there really wasn't a lot of work about Black folks online, except to say that we weren't there, or that we were deficient, or that there was some kind of gap that needed to be filled where we should bring computers into the inner city, right? That's what I was reading in my early years in grad school. And then there were folks like Anna Everett and Adam Banks who were writing these brilliant pieces at the same time, who were showcasing the complexity of what Black folks were doing with technology. And so the writing now is different, because I don't think we have to make the case anymore that Black folks are online. I don't think we have to make the case that we know how to use Twitter really well, right? Like we're funny, that we can organize. Like that those arguments have been written. They've been written not just in like academic journals, but they've been written in the New York Times and BuzzFeed, and everyone is, as you point out, privy to some spaces now that really seem to be more private before. And I think that there is some lamenting on some of our parts of watching our favorite bloggers become national figures where everyone's reading their work. I'm really happy for the folks in this book that I wrote about in the blogosphere in 2010, who were making no money from all of this brilliance, now actually being able to support their families based on their writing. There's something really lovely about that. But there also is something really devastating about not having those spaces anymore. But I'll say this. Black folks have always had their spaces taken, have always had things appropriated, have historically created and produced amazing things and had those things taken and have done it again. And if there is one thing that I am consistently sure of, is that Black folks will find ways to do it again, right? Because every time something gets taken up and taken away and no longer holds the same meaning anymore, we find new ways to create the spaces that we need to do the work that must be done. And so it's not to say we shouldn't challenge and we shouldn't push back against systems of appropriation. We should obviously be pointing those out, and we should be making sure that it's clear that folks get credit for the things that they produce. I'm writing a lot about content creators right now on TikTok and that notion of credit and of production. But again, it points to me the fact that like the beauty shop still exists. And it's such a powerful metaphor in that way, because it still exists, really still apart in a lot of ways. I don't know about your beauty shops, but the ones I go to are not frequented by other folks. There is still a collective space for Black women that exists both offline and I would argue online. And that online space might shift from places where researchers can easily gather that data, like Twitter, to group chats. It might shift to apps like GroupMe or WhatsApp, where people are now doing the organizing work outside of the purview of the dominant group, because we're also very good at knowing when our stuff is being taken and how our stuff is being taken, because it always has been taken. And so that might require researchers to rethink our approaches even more. As folks are intentionally keeping things away, we might need to ask ourselves the question of, just because we can scrape the data, just because we can get access, does that mean that we should? And I think it is a perpetual question for qualitative scholars to ask themselves about what spaces we are welcome within and which spaces we are not. And when we're not welcome in a space, honoring that and accepting that that means that we're not the right researcher for that project.
Excellent. I could go on, but I will yield the floor to my colleague, Patrick Warfield, who will moderate questions. So please feel free to put your hand up. Patrick, you can give the instructions and field the questions. I'll be back on at the end.
First of all, thank you so much, Professor Knight Steele. That was really extraordinary. I felt so privileged to have been able to witness some of that conversation that two of you just had. Really, really wonderful. You can drop questions in the chat. You can raise your hands, and I see Sophia has a hand up. So would you like to unmute and ask your question? And introduce yourself if you would, please.
Yeah, so hi everyone. I'm Sophia Fleming. I am a PhD student at the University of Georgia. I study Black feminism as well. And I study Black women exclusively. It's just because as a Black woman, we're in a time period where centering Black women is very important. I think it's a key to understanding relational dynamics with race, gender, and class, and just continuing that like rich work that we've always done, and placing it in the academic context so that we can like keep it moving and try to like dismantle some of the oppression and things that all affect us, right? It does affect everyone. But my question is, I study out of Wells and I study digital content and information, and I study like the connection between the past and the present and the future, right? And this is just an exciting book, Dr. Knight Steele, that you have written. I'm super excited about it. And my question is, so you were talking about Anna Julia Cooper and Zora Neale Hurston, and how those Black women are in your book, how you studied them, how you sat with like who they were, what they wrote, what they tried to achieve. And how do you see Black women of the past and their methods and their work entering into the space, the digital spaces, right? Especially concerning like, on TikTok and Twitter, we have this opportunity to educate people, right? And make creative content even as scholars. So how do you see that work being, how does it look to you? And how do you see that work going forward?
Thank you so much for your question. I'm excited to be in touch and to hear more about your work. It seems like we have a lot of overlaps. Ida B. Wells is actually the third historical woman in the book that I study as well. And so, thinking about so much of what we now would call data journalism that Ida B. Wells was doing, right? And how that translates to digital spaces or to digital tools, right? So how we have tools and technology that allow us to do the same kinds of work that we've always done in the past and do it in new ways. This is my solid and unabashed plug for digital humanities. And if there are grad students on the call who are thinking about doing digital humanities, you should look into our DSAW certificate in the college, right? Because so much of what we talk about in digital humanities is about asking these humanistic questions and now having access to certain kinds of digital tools that don't change doing humanities work. It doesn't mean we're not humanists anymore, but it does allow for different possibilities, right? So how can we rethink spatial questions or questions about geography with the access to digital mapping tools and GIS technology, right? How can we think about things like data journalism and what Ida B. Wells was doing while we have access now to networking tools and we have access to social media analytics, and we can use tools like In Vivo to make our work more palatable to different kinds of audiences. I think in the second part of your question, you raise an important point about how we as scholars can translate our work to a broader public. I think that that is fundamental to doing Black feminist work, right? That we are always, by its nature and by our epistemological stance, attempting to do work that is dismantling of systems of patriarchy, but we are also incorporating the voices and the knowledge and the lived experience of folks outside of the academy. We are recognizing them as co-researchers and scholars in our praxis. And so I do see so many folks on these different platforms engaging with the ideas of Black feminist thought. And I think that that is a wonderful thing. I think it is absolutely exceptional that you can turn on any app right now and find folks having these debates. I do, and I continue to say that we have to be cautious with that optimism and with that excitement about the ways that digital technology is going to do what digital technology does, which is turn things into products, right? And what digital technology is very good at is commodifying and commoditizing things, right? Of putting a price tag on them. What we have to be careful about as critical thinkers broadly is the way that our work can get taken up and can get sanitized, so that it is no longer doing the kind of subversive, transgressive work that it is supposed to do. We've seen that happen inadvertently with some of our ideas, but we can also really pay attention to ways that folks have intentionally taken up theories and ideas that are critical and about race. I think I can hint more broadly at what I'm talking about, and have made those words and those tools come to mean something completely different, right? How they've become these cultural moments where now anyone who does work about race is trying to indoctrinate, or any kind of intersectionality is just about identity. Everybody's intersectional, right? That we can take these words and we can do things with them, either inadvertently or there are nefarious figures who will try to subvert the power that's embedded in our tools and in our theory. So we must be cautious, I think, as we are optimistic and as we're excited about using these new tools in order to spread our ideas even further.
Thank you so much. Can I ask you to play with a couple of those ideas? You spoke about the need to center Black women, and you do that unapologetically in the book, which is amazing. And then also this ethical question you've been talking about several times. Can I ask you to talk about those ideas in the classroom? Like, how do you manifest those as you teach students?
Yeah, so thank you for that. I mean, different classes call for different things, but I think all of our courses call for us rethinking what is considered canon. I think one way that all of us can think about how we are acting and operating in anti-racist ways and in ways that are feminist in our classroom spaces is by whose voices get centered in conversations, not at the end of the term on the last week where race and gender get combined in the final week of the class, but rather throughout the term in whose work we assign, in who we get to deem as experts all the way along the way. I encourage folks to not wait until it is that moment where you're ready to have a conversation about race or gender at the end of the term to center the voices of Black women as you're talking about any theory or idea. We've been out here writing stuff a long time, and it's possible to do that work throughout the semester. I think it's also possible to do that work in how we assign projects to students and help them think through differentiated ways of knowing that we have the capacity to be more creative in how we allow students to not only process and write and think about the ideas that we're talking about in class, but how they disseminate them back to the audiences that they're a part of every day. So all of our students are not experts online, but some of our students already have voices in spaces online where they can take some of the really important critical ideas that we're working on in class and do the work that Sophia just brought up, right, about bringing those into alternate spaces. So I have students that create TikTok videos and create Instagram posts in my class about theory, where they are teaching other folks outside of the class some of what they've learned in those spaces. We have folks that are working using digital tools to create story maps or other ways of showcasing the knowledge that they've created in the classroom. And I want to encourage my fellow colleagues that this doesn't mean that our students don't learn how to write. This doesn't mean that they don't learn the skill sets of analysis and critical thinking that we think are so valuable in the humanities. But it means that we have to be open sometimes to the differentiated ways that people are producing and showcasing that knowledge and bringing it to a larger and broader public.
Thank you. I don't know if you saw, but in the chat, you just got a thumbs up for citational justice. Thank you for that. There is a question in the chat, which you can read if you like, but I'll try to do my best here. What are your thoughts on Black-owned digital platforms, such as Isaac Hayes III's Fanbase app, Professor Karen Hunter and Dr. Greg Carr's narrative learning platform, empowering users from various backgrounds to highlight and or promote work in the space of Black feminism and the digital humanities overall?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I'll point back to the folks that I study. Levia J.E. was brought up as one of the figures that I studied here who created her own platform toward the end of when I was writing this book. She got her fame by writing in the blogosphere and by posting those blogs on Facebook and on Twitter. And there came a moment where she decided that she couldn't actually be in charge of those posts, that they could be removed at any time, that folks could and did often flag them for inappropriate content when they didn't have any, simply to get them off of the platform. And so many folks who do activist work can point to those kinds of things happening, the kind of trolling and harassment that they experience on mainstream social media apps and other platforms. And so many content creators now are having the conversation about what it looks like to create and produce their own platforms, and what it would mean to take away that power from other folks to determine what is and what should be happening in those spaces, and repurpose that back into Black-owned spaces. I'm interested to see how that plays out. I am interested to see in our future how it looks for lots of different folks to rally behind lots of different platforms, versus there being more collective spaces where people go to have group discussions. I think we had some evidence of that in the early blogosphere, where there was a very scattered kind of Black community presence online, right? This is pre-Twitter days, right? Where you had folks who were in their different kind of pockets and corners of online space. And I think, to your question, the power in that is the notion of what Catherine Squires calls the satellite or the enclave, these spaces that are actually not trying to interact with the dominant group, that they're doing important work that is separate, discursive work that is separate. I think the challenge that we run into is when we are actually trying to interact with the dominant group, when we're trying to foster debate, when we're trying to serve as a counterpublic, what would it look like to have all of those multitude of discursive spaces without a center rallying point? And so I'm interested to see how these different platforms emerge. I'm very confident that many of them will be successful because their goals are not to do the same thing that Twitter is doing. It's not to do the same thing that Facebook or TikTok is doing. They have different purposes. And in those purposes, I have no doubt that they can be very, very successful.
And then I got a private question here. There's a moment in the book, you're talking about Mavis Beacon teaching you to type.
Yeah.
And this questioner is asking, could you comment a little bit on the kind of doors and windows that are opened by placing yourself in the story? What does it mean to be the author as part of the book?
Thank you for that. There is also, for those who haven't read it, I write about Mavis Beacon and how I learned to type on a family computer in my dad's room, right? Kind of every day after school, typing away, getting better, improving my word count, getting faster at typing. My mother said this is a very important skill set, and she was right. But there are a lot of moments in the book where I write myself into the story. And to be very honest, the way that started was just in a writing practice I have, which is when I'm stuck and I don't know what I'm going to say, I give myself permission to say instead, I type, well, here's what I would say if it were me. And then I just start writing it. And it's freedom from whatever notion there is of what an academic text should look like, or what my professional writing is supposed to seem, or how I'm supposed to be distant. And in that practice over time, in writing like that for the last 5 or 6 years, there is a recognition that too is academic writing. that narrative structure is actually supremely useful in understanding how folks come to understand, process, and place themselves in the work as well. And so the book was a real opportunity for me to take a practice that I do generally and to actually leave it there, and to allow my own trajectory, my own relationship to these places, to these women, to this writing, to be a part of the text without being the center point of the text. It also is just honest. I think it would be gravely dishonest for me to pretend like I wasn't in those blogging spaces, like I didn't have a personal relationship with a lot of the blogs and the comments that I was writing about, that they weren't deeply impactful to my life. I don't know how to write in that kind of a dishonest way. It would have felt really, really separate from all that I've learned about Black feminist epistemology for me to remove myself and my own positionality from the text. I think there is power in speaking to what knowledges we can and can't have, what spaces we have and haven't entered, and what we have the capacity to give in our research. So I started every chapter kind of with a little story that helped think into the work or helped lead us into it. I thought that the dean was going to bring up my persistent writing about Lauryn Hill when he asked about music, because that's what was playing while I was writing that chapter. And it just there were moments in that album that really connected with me about the transition from hip hop feminism to digital Black feminism. And it felt important to the reader that I kind of walk you through how I got to that place so that hopefully it could help get readers there as well.
Thank you. And we're coming close to the end of our time. I'm going to turn it back over to the Dean in a moment. But before I do want to remind everybody here that the next session in our series will be Wednesday, October 26th, again at 9 o'clock over Zoom. And we'll hear from Dr. Michael Ross, professor of history, speak on yet another very timely topic, the Supreme Court stare decisis and the inapt comparisons between the Dobbs decision and Brown versus Board of Education. But before we move on to that, Dean Shonican, you want to ask anything else or bring us home?
Yes. Okay, so we have basically 4 more minutes. We all have long days ahead of us, so I'm not going to say much here, but I think there's something, Catherine, if you could speak for 1 minute on
Yes.
how difficult this work is, you know, how difficult it is to take stances like yours. I'm thinking of the question that Sophia asked, you know, as a grad student who is also moving in these spaces and trying to get through, what advice could you give to our students, our graduate students, your colleagues like myself who write about Black stuff, you know, and sometimes get questioned by the academy about the value of the work that we do?
Yes, 1 minute. Here we go, timer. I think that it was incredibly difficult in graduate school to find a voice that said, I'm going to write about this thing because it matters. And I think one thing that was incredibly helpful to me was having some supportive faculty along the way who carved out space for me to do this kind of work, and who stood up in ways that I didn't have in my person, in the figure that I hold. I didn't have the capacity to stand up. And I think that therefore it is incumbent upon us as faculty to make those spaces for our students and to carve out spaces for folks to be authentic in their work, to provide them the absolute best in terms of training, so that when they are doing this work, they can do so with the full knowledge that doing work about Black women does not make this less rigorous. And I often say that at the start of talks, right? That writing about the community that I belong to did not mean this wasn't a rigorous project that was deeply embedded in ethical practices and methodologies. We can do both, and we can do both well. And I'm sure of that now. And I see it partly as my responsibility to create spaces for other folks to do that work as well. So another like shameless plug to come join me at the BCAT lab if you're interested in doing this work on campus, because that's what we're trying to do there, is craft spaces for folks to be able to do this work ethically, with good training and with the support systems needed to do it well.
Excellent. There's a great question here. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into it. It's a great question about archives in the communities and neighborhoods, which I think fits right into the kinds of spaces where we get this data and this work.
Absolutely. Hit me up on Twitter. We can chat there. Yeah.
Okay, so I was going to say, please follow Catherine at SteeleCat717. You can see more of her work. She mentioned BCAT. It's something we're also very excited about here at the University of Maryland. Follow her work there, and also follow us on Twitter at UMD_ARHU. The thing I love to do with books is often go to the very first sentence or the very last sentence. And for this, I'm going to go to Catherine's very last sentence. I love the way she ends this book. And that's the way we will end our morning. She says, and really, it is complicated. So let's understand and realize and remember and acknowledge that this work is indeed complicated. It takes effort, deliberation, and we're so grateful to Catherine for creating this space for us to engage on something that is critical to all of us, and that is digital Black feminism. Thank you all.